ISA server is installed, now what? I love asking that question just because I can relate so well to it. I've been trying to learn Linux forever, and it doesn't matter the distribution, Red Hat, SUSE Linux, FreeBSD, I install it, and I ask this question. I'm like, hey, I got it installed. There's the GUI in front of me or a command line, and now what? And usually what I do is I stare at it for a good hour or so, and then I say, forget this, and I format the system and install Windows. Unfortunately, that's been my Linux experience, and I hope not to replicate that experience with ISA Server. And the reason why is because once ISA Server is installed, the default rule is to deny everything. Everything. And that's going to have some pretty big ramifications, not only on your network. I mean, we don't expect our network to suddenly, hey, have internet access. I'm talking about the ISA server itself. So what I want to do is I want to go through the factory installed defaults of ISA server, talk about the system policy, which is where we're going to get into the capabilities of what the ISA server is able to do. So we'll go through what it is and how to manage the ISA server remotely, and even some more onto that to allow the ISA server to do some basic functions. From there, we're going to configure ISA to perform basic network services. So I guess I just grouped what I just said into that. And what I mean by that is, for instance, what if you wanted your ISA server to be a DNS server? What if you wanted it to be a DHCP server? What if you have ISA server connected to an ISP? For instance, you're using it in a SOHO environment, and that ISP gives you a dynamic IP address. Well, ISA server doesn't allow that by default. So all of those things I'm going to group into that one bullet point to configure it for basic network services. Finally, by the time it's said and done here, I'm going to configure the firewall to allow outside access. And that means our internal network will be able to access the internet through the ISA server. Well, let's start things off by talking about the factory installed defaults for ISA Server 2004. Now, if I were to tell you all the factory defaults, there would be enough to fill pages and pages. There would be enough to probably fill this entire nugget with just factory installed defaults. I wanted to boil it down to what I call the big four rules that you have to be aware of that ISA Server does by default. First off, no traffic at all is allowed through the firewall because there is a single deny access rule. And I'm going to show you that rule in just a moment when we get into the ISA Server Administration interface. What that means, and when we get into the firewall rules, this will make a little more sense, is that there's only one rule that the firewall adheres to, a single deny rule. Now that rule will always be there. It will always remain even after we configure the ISA server. Now you might think, well, what's the point of that? Because with the ISA server, it processes these rules in order. And what we're going to do is bump that rule down to the bottom. And what that means with our configuration is that if we don't allow access, we're going to go down our list and hit that bottom deny rule. So if we don't allow access, all other traffic will be denied. That's a pretty huge rule to keep in mind. From there, only the local admins on the ISA server box and the domain administrators can manage the ISA server. Now, when I say domain admins, you know that the enterprise admins are also a member of the domain admins and can do that as well. Those are just the two big groups that are assigned rights to that. Now, the local administrator account is given access. So if you assign a weak password to the local administrator account and don't make your ISA server box a member of the domain, maybe you have some security rules on there, beware, because people can get in and start hacking into the ISA server box. Now, you know, there's one thing I also want to mention. It's not part of my big four, but it's definitely going to save you some headaches. By default, the ISA server does not respond to ping messages on the inside or outside interfaces. That means when you're trying to ping it, for instance, you bring it up, you install ISA server, you're like, okay, let's see if I can get there. Ping, deny. You know, it's pretty much going to say no response, no response. And the reason why is ISA server has a rule to deny those pings from everybody except one or two workstations. And I'll explain what those are in a moment. From there, rule number 3. NAT, network address translation, is automatically configured between the internal networks and VPN networks to the external. As a matter of fact, let me grab just a blank white slate here and show you what that means, because I know we haven't gotten too deep into the terminology yet. Let's say we've got our ISA server, right there, ISA. And that is connected over here to the internet. Okay. On this side, we have an interface connected to the internal network. And that internal network has all our inside clients. And maybe, there might be, for instance, on the Cisco side, and I know a lot of Microsoft admins know what a VLAN is. So you could have multiple VLANs over here that have different subnets that are allowing access. Those are all by default considered the internal network to the ISO server. Now, let's go back to our facts chart right here. And we've got the NAT is automatically configured between the internal networks and VPN networks to external. So what that means is when we're configuring our ISO server right here, by default, even though there's a deny rule, if we were to allow traffic, it automatically does network address translation from our internal group out to the internet. And I know internal and internet start with the same thing, but that's what that cloud is. And in addition to that, out here, I know this sounds really weird, but we have this group of VPN clients. We can configure ISO server to accept VPNs. And even though they're coming in the external interfaces, the ISO server really sees the VPN networks kind of like this, as if it was an internal network, if you will, over here, and it's going out through the ISO server. So let's say somebody is on a VPN connection, and you want them to use the ISO server to filter their internet traffic. Maybe there's some other reasons you have for that. For instance, you want to make sure they're not accessing inappropriate websites or something like that. So when they connect to their VPN, even though they're directly connected to the internet, that traffic can route into the ISO server, then loop right back out to the internet to apply all your filtering standards that you have. By default, ISO server will perform NAT from your VPN network too. Now that goes right along with this last fact. Routing relationship is defined between internal and VPN networks. That means that ISO server will be a router from this group to these groups. So maybe over here you have 172.16.1 as your addresses that are being assigned to the external VPN networks. And inside of the networks, maybe you're using 192.168.1.0. Sorry for the horrible handwriting. I'm just scribbling as fast as I can. It will actually route between these two, as in the internal networks will see the VPN guys as their real addresses. And likewise, the VPN guys will see your internal network with their real addresses. You can change that if you wanted to. You can have the VPN networks appear as a 192 subnet or something to that effect if you wanted to. However, normally it's not necessary, which is why that default rule is in place. With those big four rules under our belt, that brings us to the ISO server system policy and starts taking us into the world of configuration. Now, don't worry if you can't read that little screen cap that I've shrunk down to fit on that slide. That is a picture of something known as the system policy editor in ISO server. This is a new feature. Those of you that are from the ISO server 2000 world, you didn't have anything like this. It was pretty much you had your rules that applied to the ISO server, it applied to the clients going through the ISO server. It was kind of all in one place. Now, we have this system policy which allows you to control access to and from the ISO server rather than through the ISO server. And that's the way I think of it. Just think, to the ISO server, anything in the system policy will be to the ISO server versus through the ISO server. All the rest of the config that we'll look at is through the ISO server. So, I'm ready to get into some live configuration here. Let's check out this ISO server and look at the interface for ourselves. Alright, we've made our way to a remote desktop session with the ISO server machine. Now, immediately, if you're like me, your eyes immediately tracking there. Limited or no connectivity. Now, that's an error message just popped up when I started recording. And I'll tell you why that is in just a little bit. But I want to walk through. I mean, we've installed the ISO server. It seems to be running. Now what? That's the question I want to answer. First off, first thing I do, if you haven't done this before you installed ISO server, it's something to do afterwards. I'm going to go to the properties of my network places, and right there are my two network cards, local area connection and local area connection 2. Meanwhile, let's go ahead and bring up a command prompt, do an ipconfig just so you can see what's going on. I have local area connection. This is connected to my internal network and is given an IP address from the internal network range. Now, local area network connection 2 goes to the outside world, and you can see that's the one having the problem as of right now. So what I'm going to do, I'll minimize that and just rename these guys. I'm just going to say, instead of local area network or local area connection, I'll do internal connection. And then over here, I'll go ahead and make this one my external connection. Trust me, huge good practice right there, because it will help you as you go through these to figure out where you're at and just get your bearings, because whenever you're doing IP config, seeing that is so difficult to figure out where you're at. Now, I've got that set up, my internal and external connection. Now, I just mentioned one of the big four rules was to deny all access going to and through the ISA server. There's some pretty huge rules in place right now restricting it. Now, I mentioned that I was on a remote desktop session. As a matter of fact, I'll prove it to you. I'll slide my window down right there, and you can see, aha, remote desktop. That's where I'm at right now. Oh, now I can't get it tracked right. But in the general window. I did that just by opening my computers and checking the box next to enable remote desktop on this computer. Now, it's great until you install ISA server. I mentioned ISA server stops all traffic to and through the server, so how is my remote desktop session working? And furthermore, it brings up the big question of the fact that I am on a different subnet right now. I am not on the 192.168.4 subnet. So how is the ISA server even getting to me? All these questions I want to answer right now. First off, let's address the remote desktop thing. I'm going to open the Microsoft ISA server. I was on a remote desktop session. As a matter of fact, I'll prove it to you. I'll slide my window down right there, and you can see, aha, remote desktop. That's where I'm at right now. Oh, now I can't get it tracked right. But in the general window. I did that just by opening my computers and checking the box next to enable remote desktop on this computer. Now, it's great until you install ISA server. I mentioned ISA server stops all traffic to and through the server, so how is my remote desktop session working? And furthermore, it brings up the big question of the fact that I am on a different subnet right now. I am not on the 192.168.4 subnet. So how is the ISA server even getting to me? All these questions I want to answer right now. First off, let's address the remote desktop thing. I'm going to open the Microsoft ISA server 2004. Ignore what you just saw, because this is where the page starts right here. When you first install ISA server, it's going to take you to this screen. Getting started with ISA server. Let's swoosh our little swoosh bar over. And this is the step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 to set up ISA server. Now, the only reason you would use these is typically if you don't really know how to configure ISA server in the first place. You can click on define ISA server network config and work through it. And I'm telling you, it looks simple, the big pictures, and looks all pretty. But when you click on it, it's not like a true wizard. It says define your networks, and sure enough, it takes us to the network, and it's going to be pretty much a help menu telling you this is what you need to do. So you really need to understand how to configure ISA server before you get into this. You can't just expect kind of a wizard walkthrough. And plus, once you know how to configure it, you're not really going to use this wizard in the first place. So, what was I talking about? Remote desktop. How am I able to access via remote desktop? Well, let's look at the two areas. First off is I'm going to go under this firewall policy, which shows the default rules through the ISA server. Remember I said that there was this one rule, deny all? Look at it. Last rule, that's the order. Default rule, deny all traffic, that's the protocols, from all networks to all networks from all users. It's pretty brutal. Nothing is allowed through. Now, whenever I'm looking at the firewall policy tab right here, every rule that I have defined is a rule restricting or allowing access through the ISA server, not to the ISA server. That's the job of the system policy I was just talking about in that last slide. Let me expand this. I'm going to go to, you see the firewall policies. We'll get into all that. That's all through. Right here is where I'm looking, the system policy. I can edit the system policy, show the rules, import or export. I'm going to go ahead and first click on edit. And this brings up that familiar window we saw in the screenshot from my slide. That is the system policy editor. All this is a pretty front end for, let me show you. It gets ugly. I'll click on show system policy rules. This whoosh. These are all the default rules that apply to the ISO server after installation. Remember, I told you you could spend this entire video talking about each one of these rules, and I boiled it down to the big four. Now, this is all the rules that say allow this, allow that. So there is some traffic. Let me whoosh this over. Whoosh. This one allows certain traffic to come to and from this ISO server. Now, I personally like using the system policy editor than looking at this because, well, it's just too ugly. I like bringing this up and hitting edit system policy, and underneath here, for example, let's take a look at this. We have network services DHCP. DHCP in general is enabled, and this enables the configuration that allows access between trusted DHCP servers and the ISO server. We click on from, and it says this applies to internal. And here's what that means. ISO server can get an IP address from a trusted internal DHCP server. That should also give us a little clue as to what's going on here. Our external connection isn't getting an address, and it only trusts internal sources, so ... I'll let you fill in the blank there. Now down here you can go through DNS, NTP. I was in the midst of asking, why can I manage this thing remotely after ISO server installation? Let's check it out. We click on remote management, and right there I've got my MMC where I can say I can allow certain people access through the MMC, and so right there it says what it's all about, and I click from, it says remote management computers. Well, that's not too informative. Let's check this one, terminal server. That's really remote desktop protocol. And you come in here, it says allows you to use terminal services from remote management computers. ICMP ping from remote management computers. Who are these people? Well, if you look at this, let me hit remote desktop, which is what I'm using to manage this right now. Remote management computers, I'll click on edit, and it comes up and says, well, the people that are in that group are 192.168.2.50. That's swell. How did that get in there? Did I set that up before? Well, the first thing I want to show you, you can see I've got kind of a half start menu open over here. I'm going to open a command prompt on my local machine. Now, this is not in the remote desktop session. This is on my local Windows XP box. Just do an IP config. And right there, 192.168.2.50, that is my computer that I'm using to manage this ISO server machine. Did I add that address in there? No. Now, I know some of you are like, what? How did it get there then? Well, I installed ISO server through a remote terminal session. I did not actually log on locally to that machine. I actually have that server in another room because it gets too hot in here. It kicks off too much heat, and so I moved it to another room and manage it from here remotely. I'm getting my little pop-up again. Can't get an IP address. When you install ISO server remotely, it automatically adds the machine you install it from as a remote management computer. Otherwise, it would devastate you. I mean, you could be, sitting in Arizona managing a server in Oregon, and all of a sudden install ISO server, and poof, all your network's cut. So Microsoft does you a favor by adding your IP address to the remote management computers. Now you can add more if you'd like. By default, this machine is the only one that can remotely manage ISO server. I can click on add and add another individual computer, a whole range of addresses, or a subnet. And, I could put local subnets. I got to show you the network diagram of what we're working on. Might fill in a couple blanks. I'll show you that in a second. Let's say I wanted to add 192.168.0.0. Well, any address starting with 192.168 will be able to manage this ISO server. Well, it comes to the network mask / bit notation, and there's so many names for this. Some people say it's CIDR notation. Some people call it classless notation. Some people call it IPv6 notation. What else have I heard? Slash notation, bit notation, CIDR. There's a whole bunch of names for this. If you haven't seen this before, it's really handy. It's a shortcut for assigning a subnet mask. For example, if I put a class A subnet mask, 255, you have a /8. All this is the number of binary ones in that subnet mask. For instance, if I broke 255 down to binary, you'd have 8 ones. If I do, 255.255, it's the /16. And it fills it in right there. Likewise, I can go backwards and say /24 for a class C mask, or a /30 for a WAN link. And now my Cisco side's taken over me. But it will actually figure out the decimal subnet for you. It's kind of handy. So if I wanted anybody from the address starting with 192.168, that's the subnet mask I would use. I can click OK, and I've added that to the remote management computers for terminal server. Okay, I'll hit cancel, so it'll cancel that. Same thing there. And as I click OK on this, like I said, it's just a pretty window to allow all of this to be configured. IsoServer will add these rules to me. And if you look at this, let's see if I can find it here. Allow remote management from, well, I guess there it is. It brings me straight to the terminal server. Let me go back here. It says from selected computers, allow. And it says what protocol? RDP, that's Terminal Services, Remote Desktop Protocol. From the remote management machines to the local host, and all users are selected. So this is a list of rules that are covered in this system policy. All right, I think you guys got that much. This is a system policy editor. Now, let's see. I've talked about remote management. We've got that good to go. Now let's talk about why this is failing. Because this is actually the biggest pain in the rear I've ever seen. DHCP addresses assigned to the external interface of IsoServer is brutal. And if you don't see this, it could cost you hours of time. I mean, it cost me hours of time when I was first exploring IsoServer 2004. Here's the idea, right? The concept behind this is pretty simple. Network services, DHCP. By default, it only trusts internal addresses to assign it a DHCP address, or internal DHCP servers. So, simple enough, right? We just add external networks to this. And the way we do that is we just click on Add, and IsoServer has a handy-dandy list of networks already defined. For instance, let me expand all these out. You can see I have external networks, which encompasses anything on the internet, internal networks, which is encompassing anything on the internal. And if you're like me, and forgive me for just digressing left and right, because we're just getting into IsoServer, and I know we're talking about a lot of stuff that is just kind of new concepts. These are all defined elsewhere. Let me close out of this real quick. I'm going to expand the configuration, and you see networks. We've seen this screen before when I was first showing you IsoServer and what it looks like. Down below you see the networks, external, which is, it says built-in network object representing the internet. And I open that up, and there's not much to configure there. IsoServer figures that out for you. Internal addresses is what we configured when we installed IsoServer, and we can modify those, saying certain ranges are added, certain ranges are removed, and so on. So all of these networks are what we're able to configure here when we're editing our system policy. Let me get back to that DHCP rule from, I click on Add, and if you expand these, those are all modifiable networks that you can create. You can even create more networks and group together different groups of addresses. But I digress. You see right here, external, so immediately, I know a lot of you are thinking, okay, to get this IsoServer, which is now trying again to get an IP address, to get an IP address from an external network, you need to add external, or maybe, anywhere, which is a set that allows anybody, or all networks. There's many ways that we could approach this one. So you add that to the list, right? And voila, you're done. That takes care of it, huh? Well, not really. And this is where the time cost really comes in. I'm going to click on OK. And it's going to take a while because IsoServer is behind the scenes reconfiguring that rule. It's setting it up. And we see a very cool new feature that IsoServer 2004 provides. IsoServer 2000 never did this. This one right here. When we make any change to the IsoServer, for example, let me scroll down and see if I can find that rule. DHCP. DHCP replies from DHCP servers to IsoServer. That's the name. And I scroll over here and you can see it's added the external network in the from field. It did that for us. Now it's saying, you've done that. Now, do you want to apply it? Let me explain this feature and then we'll click it. Apply and discard allows you to either accept a bunch of changes that you've done or discard a bunch of changes. Here's why that's cool. You can go through and configure IsoServer to do whatever you want it to do, but never hit the apply button. So you could totally hose the configuration, totally goof it up, and then say, you know what, I've totally goofed it up, discard. Boom, and it reverts back to the last pre-apply section, meaning as soon as I hit apply, let's do that now, you can see it comes up with a little status message. It's going through and making all the changes that we've set up. Now it will have a new base configuration, and if I make more changes, we'll get that little apply or discard box, and I can either go back to the config, which is right now, or accept all of those changes that I've made since then. So very cool new feature there. Now, back to our project at hand. We are allowing DHCP requests, right? And it seems like that's it. However, it won't work. I could go back here, do an ipconfig, even throw an ipconfig/renew EX. Oh, I just remembered what I forgot to show you. I'll show you that in a second. It was for the remote management. Show you that in just a second. ipconfig/renew EX star, and put that renewal request through. You can see it's trying again, and it will fail. I guarantee you it will fail because as of right now, even though I've named external and internal network, ISOServer has no idea what this interface is. As a matter of fact, watch this. Let me minimize it. I'm going to go to this monitoring tab, which takes me to the dashboard. This is the dashboard where it shows, pretty much everything that's going on. And you can see configuration error coming up right there, and I click on alerts, and it says, whoa, we even have some more security alerts there. Look at that one. Invalid DHCP offer. It says the DHCP offer IP address is not valid. What's that all about? Let's expand it. It says invalid DHCP offer. ISOServer denied the assignment of the IP address 68.3.166.216, which is an external IP address, to the network adapter external connection since the IP address offered is not included in the internal network IP addresses. What kind of insanity is that? It's kind of like, well, it's not supposed to be, right? It's an external network adapter. Well, the reason why it's giving us this message is because it doesn't know that this interface is connected to the external network. We named it external connection, but there's no way to actually label to the ISOServer and, right click and say, this is the external connection. And this only applies, let me preface this only applies to ISOServer deployments that are being assigned a DHCP address from the outside world. This does not apply to external addresses that you statically assign to your ISOServer. In my experience, SOHO, the small office home office networks, typically use DHCP for their external connections, whereas medium and large offices use static addresses. So this applies to those of you that are setting this up for a small business environment. Let me minimize this. This is a key. I'm going to expand this out, and you can see alert task, reset the alert, acknowledge, and then it says renew DHCP addresses. Look at the message it gives us. Are you sure you want to renew all DHCP addresses while allowing any offered address? Essentially, that means the ISOServer is giving you a message saying, I'm going to go against all my gut feelings right now and allow any offered address that's given to me, which will now allow that external network to grab an external IP address. Does that make sense? As of right now, ISOServer doesn't know that the external network card, the NIC card, is plugged into an external network. It thinks maybe it's another internal network card. It doesn't know. So we need to say yes in that case to allow it to accept any address that it gets from the service provider. Oh, did you see that? It just went away. Bring up my, it's still kind of hung there. I'm going to hit Control-C, do an IP config, and voila. There's my service provider, Cox.net. They're the West Coast service provider for the United States, one of them for cable modems. And I now have received an external IP address. And, now we can explain these configuration errors. It's saying, I've detected invalid routes because I don't know which card is the internal network card and the external network card. So that's huge, huge. Just remember there is that field there. Discovering that field cost me hours when I was first learning ISOServer 2004, because you can put as many firewall policies as you want saying DHCP replies are allowed from the external network, but until the ISOServer realizes what network card is the external network, it will have no idea whether or not to accept a DHCP reply on an interface. Now let me talk about what I forgot to mention just a moment ago on the remote management. Let me get back to my desktop here and bring up a command prompt. Now we have an external address, so this will even look better now. I've got my IP config, and I've got my external address, default gateway, and so on. Notice that my internal network connection has no default gateway. It's actually highly not recommend. Actually, you can't do it. Don't put a default gateway on the internal connection. I should say you can do it, but it will really goof things up because you can't have two default gateways on a single Windows box. It won't know which one to use. So here's the problem, and this happens in so many networks nowadays. You're going to think I'm such a geek when I show you this. My home, which is where I have this all set up right now, my home is not a mere home. It is actually a enterprise corporate network, if you will. I actually have a Cisco multi-layer switch that is doing VLANs. Now, I know even if you're solely in the Microsoft side of the game and you haven't ever seen Cisco before, you probably have heard the concept of VLANs, which is where you can have, I'm going to bring over an internal network diagram for my house. It's kind of embarrassing. But this is my house. Even if you're on the Microsoft side of the ball game, you probably have heard the VLAN term before, which is where you have a single switch. This is a multi-layer switch that can split up one network into many sub-networks and allow pretty much broadcasts to remain in certain networks. It also acts as a security boundary. Let me just show you how I have my house set up. Let me grab my little annotation pen here. Just to give you an idea, because this will be the network topology we use throughout the rest of this, because it actually emulates a perfect corporate environment. Now, I know this is impossible to see these small little terms down here. This is actually VLAN 100 down here. It's called servers, and it's 192.168.100.0 /24. So it's a Class C subnet that has, I'll put SVR, servers on it. That's where I have my Active Directory domain controllers, my print servers, and everything like that. Now over here I have VLAN 200, which is my clients, 192.168.2. So I'll put 2, it's the 2 subnet, .0 /24, and this is clients. That's, for instance, when I brought up my command prompt on my local machine. Let me see if I can do that. It's not showing up now. Let me minimize that. Oh. Never mind. When I brought up my command prompt on my local machine, the command prompt showed 192.168.2.50, which is right here. Now my ISA server, well, hang on, I'll explain that later. Over here I have VLAN 300, which is the wireless VLAN, 192.168.3.0, and this is where all my wireless clients, I'll put wireless right here, subscribe to. They get an address from this range, and I have a heavy security boundary set up right here to where only certain wireless clients can get in because, well, I'm not much of a wireless guy. I know WEP, I know basic security, but I'm not too advanced on that, so I use my router security to keep rogue wireless clients out. Finally, over here I have a voice VLAN, which is used for a voice over IP network I have running in my house. This is the .60 VLAN, 192.168.60. So these are all the internal clients. Now, typically, this is my normal home network config. As I mentioned, I'm a PIX guy. This is actually a PIX firewall going to a Cisco 1700 router right here. But I have actually completely disabled this whole section of my network. It's toast. Because what I've done now is I've created a new VLAN off of this switch right here that goes to, it's actually VLAN 400, which I have connected to the ISA server. The ISA server is connected to my Cox DHCP signed address and has taken the place of my PIX and my router and everything like that. This is the 192.168.4 subnet. And thus, that's where we had that address before, 192.168.4.3, which is assigned right here. And this switch/router is 4.1. So it's actually routing between many internal networks and my ISA server. Does anyone see a problem with this? Any problem at all? Well, if the ISA server does not have a default gateway on its internal network, how on earth is it going to get to all these different subnets? It only has the default gateway going that way. So how does it reach these guys? Well, since this is such a common network config for the real world, that's why I wanted to show this to you, you actually have to set up a routing table on your ISA server. I'm sitting right here, I have my IP config, and as of right now, now I can bring up my prompt. 192.168.2.50, which is my client. This is my local machine, not the ISA server, which is right here. I'm managing it remotely. How is it getting to that subnet? Well, to set up a routing table on a Windows server, you use the route command. I'll do a route /?. You can see all these different commands. Route/print will show you your routing table. Wow, I've been talking for a while. My throat, I think, just closed up when I stopped. I type route/print, and I have right here, this is a static route that I added to reach 192.168.0.0. Anything, and this is a Class B subnet, anything starting with 192.168, go to 192.168.4.1, which is that router in my switch. The way I did that, let me hit the up arrow a couple times, was I used a command like this. I just did route add 192.168.0.0 mask 255.255.0.0 192.168.4.1. That's all you have to type is up to here. You can expand on that and add a hop count or what interface you should use, or you can just let Windows figure it out for you, which is what I did. And that is how I ended up with this, oops, right there, this entry in my internal routing table. So now I don't need a default gateway to reach my internal network. If you have internal VLANs in a business, which most companies, I would say 80 to 85% of companies, big companies nowadays, have VLANs. This is the kind of thing you'll have to set up to allow ISOServer to have the right direction to go to reach those internal network connections. Okay, so that pretty much describes how I'm able to manage this ISOServer remotely, even though I'm not on the .4 subnet, and describes how to get a DHCP address from the outside. The last thing I think we need to do in this nugget is to talk about how we allow our internal clients now to use this ISOServer to access the internet. What this is going to require is a rule that allows all internal users access through the ISOServer. I'm going to walk you through the creation of this rule, but keep in mind that this is probably not the best practice when you're doing this, because it will allow all users to use all protocols to access anything on the internet. This is not talking about specific users having specific rights. This is just something to get us up and running to where we can test the ISOServer and see what's happening. So let's go ahead. I'm going to hide the system policy rules, which gets us back to now the firewall policy, which is the rules through the ISOServer, not to the ISOServer. So I'm going to click on, under this swoosh bar, still trying to figure out what to call it, the task area. I'm going to click on the Create New Access Rule. And that will bring us up to a wizard that will create a new access rule through the ISOServer. Let's go ahead and name this All Access. Will be our rule name. And it says, what conditions do you want to meet? Do you want to allow or deny? And I'm going to say this is going to be an allow rule, because we already have the deny everybody below. Apply this rule to all outbound traffic, and I can click, selected protocols, only outbound traffic except what I put here. And if you choose selected, you can click on add and add certain protocols, mail protocols and so on. We'll get into that. This is the allow all access. So I'll click all outbound traffic, choose next. It says applies to traffic from these sources. As of right now, nobody is in the source. So I'll click on add, and this is a familiar window from our DHCP. I'll add our internal network sources. Click on internal, add, choose next. Now it says going to these destinations. I'll click on add, and the destination will be external. So I'm allowing all from internal to external. Added that in there. Next. And it says what users. By default, all users are in there. So this will be exactly the opposite of our deny everything rule right below. You can see deny all traffic from all networks. This one allows all protocols from all internal networks. I guess that's not all networks, just internal networks to the external for all users. Our last step will be to apply this. Okay. Let's go ahead and give that a sec to apply. And once it does, this rule will now take effect and be allowing all access from the internal to the external. Now keep in mind, this has not compromised our perimeter security at all. Nobody can get in from the external to the internal at all. Everything else is denied right now due to the specific ISOServer policies that are applied. We're just allowing from internal to the external. If we click on the monitoring tab, let me go ahead and reset all these alerts. These are all the old alerts that we had from when we were initially getting it all set up. However, I'm now able to go through. Let me go ahead and right-click on these and hit acknowledge. These are all acknowledged. So when we go to our dashboard, we won't have any alerts in the session. Now you can see down here, I already have a couple secure NAT clients that are going through the ISA server. And the reason why is, well, you saw my network diagram for my home, right? I have at least 10 computers running, between laptops and computers running at any given time in my house. And those have, different sessions that are already opening up trying to access the internet behind the scenes. So the last, and you can see right there, oh, little loud packets, beep, just tiny little bits of loud packets. The last step here will be to open a web browser on one of my local PCs, not the ISA server, and to attempt outbound internet access. Over on my second monitor, I went ahead and opened Firefox, and you can see it's like bloop. It immediately jumped up the secure NAT sessions to 4, even a web proxy session. I'll explain all the clients in one of the upcoming videos. You can see right here, my Firefox is now open. I can, let me see if I can go to just the straight Google site, not the Firefox homepage. Oh, there's my email address. Don't look. I'll have all these different websites that I'm able to access. Let me just make sure I'm going to something that's not cached. And well, of course, we will definitely want to go to cbtnuggets.com. So what we're doing is opening all these different sessions, and behind the scenes, you can see, look at that, sweet. We have loud packets per second, shooting up because we're actually getting a ton of traffic now going through our ISA server, because it's allowing everybody to go through. Now we can go through each one of these and choose the session and see, all the different sessions. Here's me, 192.168.2.50. A lot of these other ones are other internal computers in my house that are accessing the internet, coming out through here. You can actually, again, we'll get into all the monitoring a little bit later, but you can actually monitor these services, see what websites people are going to, and so on. But this is, I'm just clicking through tabs at this point. This is all you need to do to get the ISA server up and running. Now, I know it sounds like a lot, but really, just one firewall rule that we've added, allowing all access going through the firewall. At that point, all the internal clients will be able to access the internet. So let's go ahead and wrap things up here. We've gone through ISA servers installed, now what? Well, a whole lot of what is what we went through. We first saw the factory installed defaults, which are mainly the big 4 rules that I talked about, that the ISA server applies to any default installation. To modify those, most likely we're going to have to get into the system policy, and we spent most of our time there exploring the system policy, talking about what it is, and just to hit it again, it is the policy that allows traffic to our ISA server, or denies traffic to our ISA server, and defines what is allowed and what is not allowed. And I think just by exploring the system policy and even talking about managing the ISA server remotely, we've kind of opened the can of all of these different configurations that we're going to be getting into as we go through the rest of this series. For instance, we saw the networks and internal, external, what do those mean? How do we add clients to it? The remote management computers. Oh, so much stuff. I mean, that's a lot of what we're going to get into, is now configuring a lot of those individual elements. We've also set up ISA server to configure or to perform the basic network services, primarily to be a DHCP client from an internet source. That was a huge part of this for a lot of you running this in a home or in a small office, where your internet address is assigned dynamically through DHCP. Using those same system policy rules, you can allow your ISA server to be a DNS server or a DHCP server by allowing where those DHCP requests and replies are allowed to and from your ISA server. Finally, the last thing that we did was configure the ISA server to allow outbound access by putting that all access rule that allowed all protocols from all sources, all subnets from the internal network to access the outside. Again, just to get us up and running. We have not at all defined certain groups that are allowed to access certain protocols. We've just allowed everybody to access everything, which at this point is enough to get us a pretty good view of what the base ISA server config looks like. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.